It is 23:30 on August 7, 1944, and the moon is completely hidden. South of the French city of Caen, a Canadian armored corps sits idling in pitch-black wheat fields preparing to do the impossible. In daylight, this terrain is a death trap, where German 80mm guns utilize a visual range of 1.5 miles to destroy Allied tanks long before they can return fire. This was Operation Totalize, the brainchild of Lieutenant General Guy Simons, a commander who had decided to turn the battlefield lights off. He had crammed 720 armored vehicles into 4 narrow columns, each only 200 yards wide. In this density, a single wrong turn meant a chain reaction collision that would destroy the attacking force before the Germans even fired a shot. What happened next would define the rest of the mission. And today, we're telling that story, so stay with us and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's return to the beginning. By August 1944, the Allied invasion of France had devolved from a grand liberation into a stationary slaughterhouse. 6 weeks after the D-Day landings, British and Canadian forces remained pinned south of the city of Caen, trapped in a relentless attrition battle that was consuming battalions whole. The Allied High Command had promised a lightning war of movement, yet the reality on the ground was a static meat grinder that claimed 2,000 casualties every single week. This was not the rapid advance the newspapers reported back home. It was a lethal stalemate that mirrored the trenches of 1916, where infantry walked into machine gun fire and tanks burned in open fields. The breakdown occurred because Allied commanders clung to a rigid, outdated doctrine. They consistently ordered attacks during daylight hours, operating under the belief that massive artillery barrages would suppress German defenses. However, the German army had adapted perfectly to this predictable rhythm. They utilized the Tiger tank's heavy armor and the terrifying range of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun converted for ground use to dominate the open terrain. An 88mm's crew could destroy a Sherman tank from 2,000 yards away, long before the Allied gunner could even see a target. As a result, German defenders maintained a crippling 3-to-1 kill ratio, destroying 3 Allied vehicles for every one they lost. On July 18th, during Operation Atlantic, this tactical incompetence reached its nadir at Verrières Ridge. The Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, the Black Watch, received orders to assault a heavily fortified hill in the middle of the afternoon. The German commanders on the ridge watched the approach through high-powered optics, waited for the Canadians to enter the kill zone, and then opened fire with everything they had. The outcome was mathematically total. Of the 325 men who advanced up that slope, 324 were killed or wounded. Only a single soldier walked back down the hill unhurt. All those lives were spent to gain a few hundred yards of burnt wheat, which the Germans simply retook the next night. Conventional leadership had failed, bleeding the army white against an unbreakable line. Because standard bravery was only producing standard graves, the theater desperately needed a commander who cared more about geometry than tradition. The Allied command hierarchy in Normandy was dominated by famous figures like Montgomery and Patton men, who led with flair and relied on intuition honed in the trenches of the First World War. Into this club of celebrity generals stepped Lieutenant General Guy Simons, a figure who seemed to belong to a different species entirely. At only 41 years old, Simons was remarkably young for a corps commander. Crucially, he had held 0 combat command posts before 1943, which meant he possessed no sentimental attachment to the obsolete tactics of 1918. While his colleagues looked backward to the previous war for lessons, Simons looked at the data in front of him with a cold, predatory gaze. His reputation among his own officers was one of terrifying competence rather than affection. He was known for a ruthless, utilitarian ethic, once remarking to a subordinate that he would sacrifice a battalion to save a division without hesitation. This icy detachment allowed him to diagnose the Normandy failure without emotion. He realized that the primary German advantage was not superior courage, but simple physics. German anti-tank guns commanded a 1.5-mile visual range across the open French fields. Because the enemy could see the Canadians coming for 20 minutes before the first shot was fired, the attackers were doomed before they even crossed the line of departure. Simons concluded that the only variable he could control was visibility itself. He drafted a battle plan called Operation Totalize that shattered every existing rule of armored warfare. He proposed launching the entire corps into a massive assault at night, using darkness to nullify the German range advantage. To suppress the enemy further, he demanded that heavy bomber fleets drop their payloads on the flanks seconds before the armor advanced, creating a corridor of chaos. His staff calculated a potential 400% casualty difference between this protected night assault and the standard daylight suicide runs. If the Germans could not see, their superior guns were useless. However, attacking at night required equipment that did not exist, so Simons ordered his engineers to build a new army in 6 days. Solving the visibility problem created a new, immediate logistical crisis. While darkness would blind the German gunners, it also made coordination between tanks and infantry nearly impossible. In standard doctrine, foot soldiers walked behind the tanks for protection. But a walking man moves at 3 miles per hour, while a tank moves at 20. Furthermore, walking infantry remained vulnerable to the random artillery bursts that the Germans would inevitably fire into the darkness. Simons realized that sending unprotected flesh against steel and high explosives, even at night, would result in the same slaughter he was trying to prevent. Therefore, he needed a vehicle that could carry infantry at tank speeds under armor protection, but no such vehicle existed in the Allied inventory. Simons turned his gaze to the M7 Priest, a self-propelled artillery piece built on a tank chassis. He realized that if the main weapon were removed, the vehicle would essentially become an armored box with tracks. He issued an order that shocked his supply officers convert 76 of these valuable artillery pieces into troop carriers immediately. The deadline was absolute. His engineers had exactly 6 days to invent and manufacture a new class of weapon before the attack launched. Field workshops transformed into 24-hour factories as mechanics worked in frantic shifts to strip the heavy 105mm guns from the chassis and weld steel plates over the gaping holes left in the front armor. The result of this frantic industrial surgery was the Kangaroo APC, the world's first improvised armored personnel carrier. Each converted vehicle could carry 12 infantrymen deep into enemy lines, shielding them completely from the machine gun fire and shrapnel that usually decimated assault waves. Because they were riding inside hardened steel shells, these soldiers effectively enjoyed 100% protection from small arms fire, allowing them to arrive at the objective fresh and alive, rather than exhausted and depleted. This improvisation fundamentally altered the physics of the engagement, shifting the advantage from the stationary defender to the mobile attacker. With the infantry protected, Simons faced the second impossibility, keeping 700 blind vehicles from crashing into each other in the dark. The sheer scale of the attacking force presented a traffic control nightmare that could easily turn deadly. Simons intended to move 720 armored vehicles across a cratered landscape in pitch blackness, a density of heavy traffic that risked massive collisions before the enemy even fired a shot. Because a standard broad front formation would inevitably disintegrate without visual reference points, the general imposed a rigid geometric structure on the chaos. He organized the force into 4 distinct columns, each restricted to a frontage of exactly 200 yards wide. This tight compression meant that every driver had to maintain perfect station keeping, but they needed external guides to stay on course. To provide these guides, Simons repurposed his anti-aircraft artillery for a role never found in any training manual. He ordered Beaufort's 40mm guns, Getty images, to align along the axis of advance. But instead of firing at aircraft, they were instructed to fire bursts of tracer ammunition horizontally over the heads of the advancing tanks. Every 10 minutes, These guns would erupt in a rhythmic display, creating lines of light that pointed physically toward the objective. Consequently, tank commanders peering out of their hatches could realign their vehicles simply by following the streaks of fire burning overhead. Simons added layers of redundancy to this visual system to ensure no unit drifted into the void. Artillery crews were tasked with firing colored smoke and flare shells to mark the corridor boundaries, placing green shells on one flank and red shells on the other to create a virtual road in the sky. Furthermore, specialized navigation vehicles planted radio beacons at 1,000-yard intervals as they advanced, building an invisible grid that allowed follow-on forces to orient themselves using wireless signals even if smoke obscured the stars. This complex system transformed a chaotic battlefield into a controlled airspace, substituting traditional sight with mathematical certainty. The plan was technically sound, but doctrinally terrifying, leading to a clash with the military establishment. When the detailed operational plans reached the headquarters of the 21st Army Group, the reaction from the British High Command was immediate and largely hostile. Senior staff officers trained to regard night operations with armor as a tactical taboo reviewed the proposal and officially labeled the concept fantastically risky. They argued that the plan relied on a level of precision that did not exist in warfare, fearing that a timing error of just a few minutes would result in the bomber stream obliterating the Canadian spearhead instead of the enemy. Because the margin between the falling bombs and the advancing tanks was razor thin, many experienced commanders believed Simons was leading his corps into a self-inflicted massacre. However, Major General George Kitching, who commanded the 4th Canadian Armored Division, stood firmly beside Simons despite the chorus of doubts. Kitching understood the grim arithmetic of the Normandy stalemate better than the distant planners at headquarters. He knew that the Canadian Army was already losing 300 men every day simply by holding static positions and conducting conventional daylight probes. Therefore, maintaining the status quo was guaranteed to bleed the army dry, whereas the night attack, for all its dangers, offered the only mathematical probability of a decisive breakthrough. With the command decision finally locked, the crews entered a frantic period of preparation that tested their nerves before the first shot was fired. They had only 72 hours of night training to master a completely new method of warfare. Tank drivers spent their nights navigating through wheat fields, where visibility dropped to under 50 yards, learning to trust the artificial markers over their own eyes. The stress was immense as they practiced formation driving in the dark, knowing that a single wrong turn could cause a chain reaction collision. To support this delicate ground ballet, the Air Forces committed 1,120 heavy bombers to the operation, a massive armada carrying enough explosives to alter the geography of France. The pilots had to deliver their payloads on a precise schedule, so that the tanks could advance into the dust cloud while the enemy was still stunned. The plan required thousands of men to act in perfect synchronization with zero room for error. At 23:30 hours on August 7th, the argument stopped and the diesel engines started. At exactly 23:30 on August 7th, 1944, the suspended silence of the Normandy night shattered. Above the waiting Canadian lines, then the heavy drone of Lancaster and Halifax bombers transformed into a physical vibration that shook the mud off the tank tracks. The air support plan delivered a staggering 3,462 tons of high explosives onto the German flanks. In a matter of minutes, a weight of ordnance designed not just to destroy bunkers, but to liquefy the entire defensive infrastructure. Because the raid was timed to the second, the concussions were still rippling through the earth when the order to advance came down the line. The operation launched under a new moon that provided 0% natural illumination, creating a darkness so absolute that drivers could not see the ends of their own gun barrels. Into this void, the Canadian Corps lurched forward, abandoning the tentative probing tactics of the previous month. Instead, 4 massive parallel columns of armor rolled out, simultaneously moving as a single, unstoppable industrial machine. The acoustic profile of the battlefield changed instantly, disorienting anyone within miles. The deep, rhythmic thunder of the aerial bombardment mixed with the mechanical roar of hundreds of diesel engines to create a wall of sound that drowned out individual thought. Inside the tanks and the new Kangaroo personnel carriers, men fought to keep their vehicles straight, their eyes locked on the faint, artificial glow of tracers overhead or the exhaust sparks of the tank directly in front. As a result of this sensory overwhelming, the expected German response was non-existent. In every standard operation since D-Day, the first movement of Allied armor had attracted immediate, accurate anti-tank fire from the hedgerows. Tonight, however, the darkness and the bombing had severed the enemy's nervous system. There were no muzzle flashes from the PaK-40s reaching out to kill the lead tanks. There were no illumination flares rising to expose the attackers to machine gun fire. The columns drove deeper into the dust clouds without taking a single hit, proving that the calculated decision to blind the enemy had worked perfectly. The sheer violence of the bombardment had suppressed all resistance, allowing the heavy machinery to cover ground that had been impassable for months. For the German defenders, the world ended in noise. But for the Canadians inside the steel boxes, the silence of the radio nets was the real shock. Inside the German defensive zone, the reaction was not coherent resistance, but absolute paralysis. Soldiers of the 89th Infantry Division, a unit that had stubbornly held the line for weeks, woke to the terror of tracks grinding past their bunkers in the darkness. Because the heavy bombers had severed their communications wire and crushed their command posts, German officers could not call for artillery support or coordinate a defense. Isolated strongpoints fired wildly into the night, but the Canadian columns simply bypassed them, driving deeper into the rear areas, while the infantry and the Kangaroos mopped up the confused survivors. As a result, the 89th Infantry Division was effectively erased from the map in a matter of hours, its regiments scattered or captured without ever forming a cohesive front. Meanwhile, Simon's navigation system functioned with the precision of a railway schedule. The Bofors tracers overhead and the radio beacons below guided the massive armored spearhead through the dust like ships entering a harbor. By 02:30 a.m., the lead units radioed that they had reached their Phase 1 objectives. This transmission represented a staggering achievement in operational tempo. The Corps had advanced 6 miles deep into enemy territory in a single, unbroken movement. In previous operations during July, gaining that same distance had required 3 weeks of grinding combat and thousands of lives. But tonight the Canadians had accomplished it in less than 4 hours. The material cost of this breakthrough was shockingly low compared to the gains. The assault force lost only 18 tanks to enemy fire mines and mechanical breakdown combined. In exchange, they destroyed 11 German tanks and overran an entire divisional sector, achieving a tactical exchange ratio that was previously impossible in the Normandy theater. Consequently, the morning reports revealed that total personnel losses were merely 1/3 of the expected casualty estimate. 2 out of every 3 men the planners expected to die were still alive, eating breakfast on ground that had been German territory the night before. The math of the battlefield had shifted in favor of the attacker for the first time since D-Day. The tactical success was absolute, but the true validation came from the casualty returns the next morning. When staff officers began compiling the operational returns on the morning of August 8th, the numbers revealed a transformation in the economics of the war. Previous Canadian offensives in the Normandy theater had averaged a punishing cost of 340 casualties for every mile of ground, captured a rate of attrition that was bleeding the army dry. In stark contrast, Operation Totalize had secured vital terrain at a cost of only 85 casualties per mile. Because Simons had substituted steel protection and darkness for human flesh, the casualty rate dropped by a massive 75% overnight. Furthermore, the speed of the assault had accelerated beyond all predictions, registering a 400% increase in the rate of advance compared to daylight operations. This statistical vindication rippled through the ranks, altering the soldiers' perception of their cold, distant commander. Men who had previously feared Simons as a butcher now realized that his mechanical approach to warfare was actually a form of mercy. By treating the operation as an engineering problem rather than a test of courage, he had preserved thousands of lives that would have otherwise been wasted in futile attacks against prepared defenses. The lesson was brutal but undeniable: stop attacking when the enemy can see you. Simons immediately applied this proven formula to the next phase of the campaign. On August 14th, he launched Operation Tractable, a carbon copy offensive using the same night-fighting tactics and armored carriers to drive the final wedge into the German lines. This relentless pressure forced the closure of the Falaise Pocket, a strategic trap that encircled the remnants of the German 7th Army. As a result of the Canadians sealing the northern exit, 50,000 German soldiers were surrounded and effectively removed from the war, turning a tactical breakthrough into a strategic catastrophe for the Third Reich. The success of these back-to-back operations codified a new reality for the Canadian Corps. They had transitioned from a static force grinding against hedgerows to a mobile juggernaut capable of shattering defensive lines at will. While the Allied press celebrated the liberated villages and the lines on the map, the German High Command was quietly updating their internal threat assessments to reflect a dangerous new adversary. The true measure of Simons' impact was found not in Allied newspapers, but in the classified intelligence summaries of the 12th SS Panzer Division. After witnessing the sudden destruction of their defenses, German staff officers wrote a confidential report analyzing the phenomenon of masked armor, their specific term for the Canadian columns that struck without warning in the dark. The document concluded with a stark admission that this specific opponent was the most dangerous commander in the Allied coalition because he refused to fight a gentleman's war. Since Simons had broken the unspoken rule that armies sleep at night, the German High Command was forced to institute a punishing new defensive protocol across the entire sector. Orders went down the line, requiring every unit facing the Canadian Second Corps to maintain a 50% alert status continuously from dusk until dawn. This meant that tens of thousands of German soldiers were denied sleep for weeks on end, forced to stare into the blackness, waiting for the roar of engines that might never come. As a result of this psychological pressure, the combat effectiveness of elite German formations began to degrade from sheer exhaustion before a single shot was fired. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army and knew the capabilities of every Allied leader, later confirmed that this fear was institutional. He stated that while other generals were predictable, Simons fought with a ruthlessness that mirrored their own best commanders. Even SS General Kurt Meyer, a man who had fought across the scorched earth of Russia, admitted in his memoirs that engaging Simons was a fundamentally different experience. He compared fighting standard British or American generals to a rough brawl, but described fighting Simons as a game of chess against a master who was always 3 moves ahead of the board. Meyer recognized that the Canadian did not rely on overwhelming firepower alone, but on a cold, intellectual dismantling of the enemy's options. While Montgomery and Patton relied on the sheer weight of material, Simons used geometry and timing to paralyze his opposition. Yet despite terrifying the enemy professional class, Simons remained a ghost in the Allied press, a pattern of obscurity that continued into the miserable waters of the Shelt campaign. By October 1944, the Canadian Second Corps had traded the open plains of Normandy for the flooded, freezing nightmare of the Battle of the Shelt. The Allied advance was grinding to a halt because the massive port of Antwerp, essential for supplying the armies into Germany, remained useless as long as German guns controlled the sea approaches. Simons faced a tactical problem that appeared insoluble to conventional minds. He needed to attack across 200 yards of tidal water, a treacherous gap of mud and brine that was too wide for bridges, yet too shallow for standard landing craft. Therefore, he once again improvised a technical solution deploying the LVT Buffalo, an amphibious tractor originally designed for the Pacific theater, to turn the estuary into a highway. The operation required the precise movement of 3,000 vehicles across these tidal flats under direct enemy fire. British commanders initially balked at the plan, arguing that the currents and mud would swallow the force whole. However, Simons ignored the skepticism and launched the assault successfully, ferrying his armor and infantry through the sludge to flank the German positions. As a result of this amphibious mastery, the Canadians cleared the estuary and opened Antwerp to Allied shipping, solving the logistics crisis that threatened to stall the entire war effort. Yet the public recognition for this achievement was virtually non-existent. While Simons was winning the complex, ugly battles in the mud that actually saved the Allied supply chain, General George Patton was dashing 300 miles across France against crumbling resistance. Patton's advance offered dramatic photos and easy-to-understand maps with big arrows, which meant he dominated the front pages of every newspaper in America and Britain. The public devoured stories of Patton's ivory-handled pistols and brash speeches, completely ignoring the quiet Canadian who had just pulled off an amphibious miracle. Simons delivered the strategic prize of Antwerp, but Patton delivered the story the public wanted to hear. The war ended, and while the loud generals went on book tours to cement their legends, the quiet innovator went back to work, building the future. After the guns fell silent in Europe, Simons did not retire to write a self-aggrandizing memoir or seek political office. Instead, he ascended to the pinnacle of his profession, serving as the chief of the General Staff from 1951 to 1955. Because the Cold War demanded a new level of professional rigor, he spent those years transforming the Canadian Army from a temporary citizen militia into a permanent, highly trained NATO asset, capable of fighting the Soviet Union. He modernized training standards and doctrine, ensuring that the hard-won lessons of Normandy were not lost to peace. Yet despite holding the highest military office in his nation for 4 critical years, his public profile remained virtually non-existent compared to his wartime peers. Montgomery and Patton became cultural icons, their names synonymous with victory in the public imagination. The disparity in their legacies was brutally illustrated when Simons died in May 1974. The New York Times, the global paper of record, dedicated exactly 6 sentences to his obituary, dismissing the man who had cracked the German lines in Normandy as a historical footnote. In sharp contrast, when Patton died in 1945, the same newspaper had printed 3 full columns of coverage analyzing every speech and mannerism. This vast gap in recognition existed because public memory favors charisma over calculation. Patton offered the media ivory-handled pistols, profane sound bites about glory, and a character that fit easily into a cinema script. Simons offered casualty ratios, technical diagrams, and discussions on geometric efficiency. As a result, Hollywood never produced a film about the mathematical Canadian, and there are no blockbusters depicting the invention of the armored personnel carrier. Culture celebrates the generals who look good in photographs, while it promptly forgets the professionals who treat war as a technical problem to be solved. Simons remains unknown to the general public, a ghost in the history books, who lacks the glamour of the blood and guts commanders. But if you look at a modern battlefield today, you won't see Patton's riding boots, but you will see Simons's steel boxes. The legacy of Guy Simons is not found in statues, but in the standard equipment of every mechanized army on Earth. The crude Kangaroos of 1944 evolved directly into the ubiquitous M113 armored personnel carrier, a vehicle that carried American infantry through the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of the Middle East. Similarly, the Soviet Union adopted the concept wholesale for their BTR series, recognizing that infantry must move under armor to survive on a nuclear battlefield. Because Simons proved that exposed flesh is a liability in modern war, The concept of the battle taxi became a universal requirement for military procurement, forever ending the era of foot-slogging infantry in major offensives. This doctrinal lineage extends even further into the design of the Israeli Merkava main battle tank Shutterstock. Israeli engineers studying the lessons of survival placed a unique rear compartment in their premier tank, specifically to carry infantry or evacuate casualties under fire. They understood, just as Simons did, that separating tanks from infantry support invites disaster. Furthermore, the 1991 Gulf War served as the ultimate validation of his tactical thesis. American armored divisions smashed the Iraqi Republican Guard using massive night attacks coordinated by GPS and thermal sights, executing Operation Totalize with better technology but identical logic. Today, Simons' methods are required curriculum at the world's elite military academies. Cadets at West Point and Sandhurst study his navigation systems to understand control, while officers at the Soviet Frunze Academy spent decades analyzing his ability to break static lines. The data explains why this obsession endures. Over the course of the campaign, Simons's corps suffered 30% fewer casualties per objective captured than comparable formations. That percentage represents thousands of Canadian men who returned to Alberta and Ontario to raise families instead of remaining in French soil. The ultimate judgment on his career does not come from the press, but from the nature of the profession itself. His goal was never fame, but to solve the lethal puzzle of the battlefield in a way that would bring his men home alive. He succeeded where others failed, earning a quiet respect that outlasts the noise of celebrity. As the German generals who fought him understood better than anyone, fear is the tribute that professionals pay to excellence.